In this video, we will talk about relative and absolute coordinates in Civil 3D. This should also work for base AutoCAD. So in this instance, I am using Civil 3D right out of the box. So I'm using the default settings, which include relative coordinates. So the default right out of the box is for AutoCAD to use relative coordinates. And I'm going to start by saying I've got dynamic input turned on. So if you're not sure, if you are typing a command in Civil 3D, you can see that I have whatever I'm typing right next to my cursor, and that is the dynamic input mode. So if you want to check your input mode, you can type dyne mode, that's DYNMODE, dyne mode, and hit enter. And you can see I've got mine set to 3. If you don't want to see anything next to your cursor as you're typing, you can set that to 0, and then everything that you type will populate down here in the command line. But I like to see a lot of that stuff right next to my cursor, so I'm going to leave mine set to 3. And then also, if you want to change the default for your input style from relative to absolute coordinates, you can toggle that by typing DYN PICOORDS. So dyne PI chords. And you can see mine is set to 0. 0 is the relative coordinates, so relative to whatever your last input was. And if you would like to use absolute coordinates, you can set that to 1. I'm going to leave it on relative coordinates for now, but I am going to turn on my grid so that we can see the origin and have a little frame of reference for where we are in our drawing. So again, we are in relative coordinates. I'm going to start typing the polyline command, so PL for polyline, and then I'm just going to create a 10-unit square starting at the coordinate 10, 10. So right now, before I have clicked anywhere or input anything, the relative coordinate is going to be in relation to the origin. So if I type 10, 10 and hit enter, then I've started my polyline at 10 units in the x direction and 10 units in the y direction. So I'm going to continue and create a 10-unit square relative to this first point that I input. So if I was going to start my square, let's say, by going 10 units horizontally along the positive x-axis and 0 units in the y direction. So I'm going to input 10 units in the x direction and then comma 0 units in the y direction. So when I hit enter, there I have my first line. Now again, I'm still in relative coordinates, so the next coordinate I input is going to be in relation to this corner. So I want to go up 10 units in the positive y direction, and I want to go 0 units in the x direction. So I will start by typing 0 units for the x direction, comma 10 units in the y direction. And you can see I have created the second leg of my square. Now the third leg, I need to go 10 units in the negative x direction, 0 units in the y direction. So I'm going to input negative 10 for x, and then comma, and 0 for my y, enter. And now I could close this polygon with a couple of different ways. I could type C and hit enter, C to close the shape. I could right click and select close, or I can continue with my relative coordinates. In this case, that's going to be 0 units in the x direction and negative 10 units in the y direction. So I'll continue that, 0 x and comma to get into my y, and I want to go negative 10 units in the y direction. And there I have closed that shape. But let's say you're maybe you've got the absolute coordinates that you want to input, and you want to connect those absolute coordinates with a polyline. So I'm going to stay in the default relative coordinates setting. So I'll start my polyline again here, and I'll start at 10, 10. Now I can force absolute coordinates without changing my drawing settings. And I can do that with the pound sign. So if I hold shift and press 3 to create the pound symbol, notice next to my cursor it did capture that pound symbol input, and it still is asking me for some coordinates. So if I'm looking for the relative coordinates to redraw that square, well, I'm talking about 20 units in the x direction and 10 units in the y direction. So I'm going to create a point or a corner of this square at 20, 10. So 20, 10. And notice it drew that same side, the bottom of my square, based on the absolute coordinates. So if I want to continue this square, my next corner is going to be at the absolute coordinates 20, 20. So to get into my absolute coordinates, I'm going to input the pound symbol, so shift 3, and I'm going to input 20, 20, and you can see it did create that second leg. Now if I want to use the absolute coordinates again based on the Cartesian plane, I'm going to be looking at 10 units in the x direction, 20 units in the y direction. So I will input that pound symbol, and I want 10 units of x and 20 units in y. And there it has created the third leg. And again, I'm going to use the absolute coordinate override. So I'm going to input that pound symbol, and I'm going to close my square by inputting 10, 10. So I have created that same square. Let me get rid of that. And let's say that I want to have my drawing set to those absolute coordinates all the time. So now I can type that dynpi chords, C-O-O-R-D-S, and I'm going to set that to 1. So now I am I'm set up in the absolute coordinate system, and I'm going to enter that polyline command and start at 10, 10. And again, in the absolute coordinates, if I want to redraw that square, I need to be at 20, 10. And it has created that leg. And now I want a corner at 20, 20. And I need another corner at 10, 20. And you can see it is using those the absolute coordinates to create that square. So let me delete this again, and I'll go back into the polyline command. I'm going to start a corner at 10, 10, just like we have been. But now let's say my drawing is set to those absolute coordinates, and I want to force relative coordinates, just like we did when we were in the relative coordinate setting and we wanted to force absolute coordinates. We can do the same thing in reverse, but instead of the pound symbol, I'm going to use the at symbol. So shift 2, and you can see next to my cursor it did capture that at symbol, and that's going to force the relative coordinates for my polyline. So relative to this first point, I want to go 10 units in x, 0 units in y. So I'm going to input 10, 0, and it should be that first segment of the square, as you can see. Now I am in the absolute coordinate setting, but I'm going to force relative coordinates. So I'm going to input the at symbol, and relative to this corner, I want to go 0 units in x and 10 units in y, and you can see it is the same square we're creating. So again, I'm going to force relative coordinates by using the at symbol, and then relative to this corner, I now need to go negative 10 units in x and comma 0 units in y, and there is my corner. So again, I'm going to force relative coordinates with the at symbol, and then I want 0 units in x, negative 10 units in y, and we have created that same square. So a little bit of input on the dynamic and absolute coordinates there, how to force either how to force either relative or absolute coordinates, and then how to change your drawing settings. So I hope that was helpful.